Hi everyone, Lucy here. I'm Megan's podcast producer, and this week, while Megan is prepping for her impending wedding, I have something a little bit different to share with you all. Megan was recently a guest on another podcast, and it's an episode you absolutely do not want to miss. She sat down with Joel Burgess on the Elevated Coach podcast for a really insightful conversation about, well, elevating your coaching practice. But it's not just about business strategy. It's way deeper than that. They talk about how Megan's why has evolved over time, especially after studying with the amazing Dr. Gabor Mate. Now, she's all about making coaching more inclusive and challenging harmful wellness narratives. Megan and Joel get real about the importance of understanding trauma and systemic oppression, especially for coaches working with marginalized communities. And they even talk about how to overcome that fear of saying the wrong thing, which I think we should all relate to. And they drop some serious truth bombs about privilege and the need for coaches to be more responsible about making their practices truly inclusive. Trust me, this episode is packed with wisdom, compassion, and actionable advice. If you're a coach, or even if you're just interested in personal growth and social justice, you need to check it out. All right, that's it from me. Go learn from Megan and Joel, and we'll be back with a brand new episode of our own next week.
Welcome to the Elevated Coach podcast. I am your host, Joel Burgess, and it is my goal that with this podcast, you are fueled with all the tools, techniques, strategies, systems, and insights to become more potent and powerful in your coaching and more profitable in your business. The podcast is a mix of solo episodes and interviews with incredible coaches doing amazing things. I really hope that you enjoyed today's show, and if you do, go ahead and share it with a coach that you think would benefit from it. Let's get stuck in. We're live with the lovely and amazing Megan, and tradition on this podcast is that the last guest asks the first question for the new guest. And the last guest asked the question, what is your why? We don't mess about on this podcast.
What is my why? It's a hard one because I feel like my why is constantly evolving. Like every day I feel like it shifts slightly. For now, the thing that feels most alive for me, and this has come through in my recent podcast shift as well, of wanting to bring a lot more inclusivity, diversity to what I see within wellness. That is one part of my why right now. And wanting to address a lot of the narratives that I see within wellness. That is a big why for me right now. Alongside that, it is really educating people about trauma and the impacts of it on an individual way. It was unbelievable for me that I didn't really know too much about the impacts of trauma, even what we would regard as small things that happened within our childhood on an individual level, but also on a much bigger societal collective level. I think there are huge things that are perhaps not within our mainstream narratives. It's becoming more mainstream, but a lot of things within our mainstream narratives really drive this big why within my work as well on kind of an individual and collective level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, beautiful. It feels like there's two threads we could go off there, and I'd love to kind of come back to the trauma piece, and there's so many questions that came up for me there, but just to kind of stay on this mission, it feels like a mission. It feels like just observing you're a woman on a mission, and I feel that in your podcast. What was the shift that kind of instigated this new direction with your podcast and this mission? Yeah, I'm really curious there.
Yeah, I guess I would pinpoint it from, about this time last year. So the last 18 months, well, a little bit longer than that now, studying with Dr. Gabor Mate, his organization Compassionate Inquiry, which is basically studying trauma and addiction, therapy and healing. And within the curriculum for that, there were a lot of lectures from around all sorts of topics from different researchers, different authors, different speakers, different activists. And a lot of it was based around topics like institutional racism, systemic trauma, societal oppression, and trauma in ways that I hadn't even thought about because I'm, a white cisgender woman who perhaps who's experienced privilege within my life, that I haven't had to think about how life is for people that aren't me necessarily. Being met with different views on systemic trauma and how that plays out on an individual level, but also on a collective level in terms of the disparity in disease, chronic disease, socioeconomic disparity, extreme poverty was so impactful for me. And also watching a lot of lectures from descendants from indigenous cultures who were talking about the impacts of colonialism today and how that has, moved down through generations. And what you see within descendants from indigenous communities is a lot more addiction, trauma, a lot more drug use, a lot more poverty, a lot more out of work, people in prison. And all of these conversations were so eye-opening for me that I was like, wow, like how are we not, how have I spent so long in health and wellness without this coming into my sphere? And as a practitioner, I need to give this a lot more airtime. And, also working alongside that of me doing the compassionate inquiry studies, I've spent the last few years doing volunteer work for local authorities. Last year, on the back of the training that I did a 4-month workshop series of trauma awareness, tools for trauma support for women who've been through significant abuse, domestic violence, criminal justice system, homelessness, addiction, extreme levels of trauma, neurodivergency, and a lot of different needs within the room. And again, as a facilitator, it was challenging because it wasn't me going into a workshop and just being able to communicate in a way that I was just used to. Even leading a meditation, I couldn't say something like, close your eyes, because for the people in the room, that felt really unsafe. When you've experienced a lot of trauma, even closing your eyes feels very unsafe. So these two different things of having to really look at how I'm being as a practitioner and who I'm perhaps not including within my spaces or not thinking to include, alongside having my eyes opened to the huge amounts of collective trauma, systemic trauma that are out there that are perhaps not being addressed by me as a wellness practitioner. Those really married into one another. Last November, I'd done my podcast for about 2 years. I took a break. I was busy with compassionate inquiry and my work. I wanted that new why to feel more embodied. I mean, you're the king of embodiment, so you get that. But yeah, really just wanting that to come through and understanding where I wanted to go with that.
I love that. I want to deflect that king of embodiment because of all the masters that are ahead of me. I feel like a little gnome in that space. But the question actually kind of comes up is like, with that awareness, I imagine that's probably quite confronting, right? And I think it really confronting, right? Having this awareness, we sort of have perhaps had your blinkers on. I've had my blinkers on for so many things, but when you had that awareness, where do you start? The purpose of that question is asking for my audience, where do we start? If you were to speak to coaches, people in the wellness industry, like where do we start? Where do people because you on your Instagram you talk of helping people beyond the echo chamber of the wellness echo chamber. I totally see that and hear that. So where did you start, and then where would you suggest others in this industry to start?
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought because I would say that I'm still in that process of starting. I think it's a beautiful place to be, to see yourself as the beginner and continue to have the beginner's mindset. I pivoted my podcast so I could learn from other people as well as taking my listeners on that journey. And I recognize that with every single episode that I do, I gain a little bit more clarity as to what I need to think about, what I need to take the next step on. And it's actually okay for me to not have the answers. I think that especially as coaches, practitioners, leaders, we're so used to having the answers and needing the answers. And it's a humbling thing to suddenly not have the answers and to open myself up to receive where I need to go next, which I know is not particularly directional. But there are so many amazing authors, activists, researchers out there who've been doing this work for decades. I follow new people every single day. On the back of that, there might be a book, a podcast, a lecture that I watch. For me, it's really just having that beginner's mindset and having the humility to recognize that everything I do might need to be relooked at. I'll give you some examples because the thing with this stuff is that it's so unconscious, like it's so ingrained into us, and we don't necessarily think that it's wrong, where it's so normal for us. But like a couple of conversations that I've had, my podcast editor, Lucy, she identifies as Arabic in her heritage. So she's biracial in that respect. I was talking to her about a comment that someone had said to me. She was like, I actually think that's a harmful, non-inclusive comment. I was like, oh, but they're such a nice person. Like, they didn't mean it like that. She was like, hang on, what's niceness got to do with somebody making actually a harmful comment? I was like, oh yeah, that is something that we do. Like, as a white person, I guess we want to justify that something is okay. We don't want to rock the boat, that type of thing. It was really interesting for me to just watch my behaviors and recognize that actually that could be harmful, just dismissing someone saying that felt harmful to me, being like, oh, but they're nice, so it's okay. Let's brush that underneath the carpet. And just looking also at like the language that we use. There's a lot of wellness jargon out there. I did an amazing episode with a woman called Kerry Jarvis who spoke a lot about this, which was so helpful for me and sent me down this huge rabbit hole around that. But she was really drawing attention to things that we say, like you create your own reality, like stuff that we put out there because, you know, it's true up to a certain point. Like, yes, of course, if I have negative biases, my world's going to look negative that day. Of course, there is truth in that. But that doesn't account for somebody who's going through domestic violence or somebody going through terrible experiences like genocide or bombings, like everything happening in Palestine. You don't create the reality of that. I think I'm getting to a point where if I wouldn't say something to a client, another practitioner or a friend, I'm just not saying it anymore because I feel like having these, I'll say it to this person, but not to that person. For me, that's the exclusivity or inclusivity thing that's happening, which I just don't want to be a part of. So coming back to your question of what can people do, I think looking at our language, the way we speak about our work, recognizing who we're speaking to, and being ready and available to actually like reconsider the language that we're using. I think that that's a really good place to start. I did a podcast episode yesterday with a woman called Sister Scribes who focuses a lot around language and inclusivity and making language as coaches and wellness practitioners inclusive. So I think that is a really good place to start. And just one more thing, because I know I've spoken for a long time around that, but recognizing our own reactions to things as well. Like I mean, through compassionate inquiry, a lot of the work was looking at what we're bringing to the table as practitioners and individuals. And so I've, you know, got tuned into like what's happening in my body, what's happening in my nervous system whilst I'm having this conversation, whilst I'm reading this, etc. And there was one comment which talked about something that white women do, which I saw on the TikTok video. And I noticed that I was really triggered because I was like, well, I don't do that. Like, that's a huge generalization. I don't do that. That's not me. And then I was like, wow, look at me. Like, I'm affronted by what a woman of color was saying about a white woman. It was really interesting. It was another example to recognize what we're bringing and as a way to take responsibility of that so that I can choose then how I'm going to respond as opposed to react, which I think speaks to the shame piece. I know that you said, how do we start on that journey? And that must have been quite a big pivot, quite a big change. It was because then all this shame came up. How I've ever not thought about this stuff before. Like, I must be a bad person, you know, all the stuff that we bring to this. And I think like metabolizing that and then stepping into like, okay, I'm going to step over that shame and then actually step into a place of firstly being receptive, secondly deciding to use my privilege in a positive way once I felt I was in that centered place. So again, just leading it back to how can people start? It's like, getting ourselves to that centered place where we can step into how we want to respond from here, as opposed to like bringing all of our baggage to the situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I'm really seeing the power of compassion and that beginner's mindset. I'm listening from my audience as well, newer coaches who are earlier in their journey putting themselves out there on social media and saying stuff. And, you know, one side I could hear that and go, fuck, I can't say anything. You know, like I've already got a lot of fear and things to think about. I can't say anything. What's really helped me is that beginner's mindset and that willingness to be wrong, but coupling that with compassion when you do get it wrong, and an openness and a receptivity. Something I've really learned, and I actually learned it from a men's retreat I went on last year, which was using your body as an indicator of what to lean into. We had an exercise where we had to actually say who we were repelled by. And we had to say, well, this person I'm repelled by. And of course, that person was the greatest medicine for me. I've learned so much from that experience. It's a big reason we're having this conversation, right? You created a post a while back that triggered something in me. And the easy choice for me would have been like, whatever, like Megan's wrong or blame you and like, it's not for me. But actually I've learned to be like, okay, there's something in this for me. There's a learning opportunity. Rather than shutting down and pushing away. It's like, let's be receptive to this and start to use that as a sign of like, where I should hold up a mirror. Where am I not aware of my prejudice? Obviously, loads of places, but let's at least have that conversation. Let's at least lean in. It can be so intimidating, this space, but we need to be responsible for what we're bringing to the table. And for me, that's an insane amount of privilege. And when you're willing to be really frank and honest with yourself, it's like, I at least need to have a conversation. I at least need to open up. The final thing I'll say that is just, I can really see that power of the beginner's mindset and compassion.
Yes.
Like that's a killer combo in this conversation. Yeah.
Totally. And I think, you know, about this fear of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, when you can get to a place of like, you're 100% going to fuck it up. You're 100% going to say the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing at some point, and that's okay. But it really came through for me. I was watching a lecture on my Compassionate Inquiry series with Gabor, and someone brought in, you know, I'm terrified of messing up my kids. I'm terrified of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing as a parent. I'm terrified of screwing them up in some kind of way. And he was like, I'm just going to put your mind at ease. You are 100% going to screw them up in some capacity because you're human. That we all do it. You can't do anything else, but all you can do is give them the tools to be able to do the healing work that is required and stay regulated. And, you know, of course, all of the other things. But for me, it was such a human response of like, of course, you're going to get it wrong. Like we're all going to get it wrong and that's going to be okay. For me, this has been a really big shift in this journey. I hate being told off. Like I get a speeding fine or a parking fine and I'm like, oh God, I've done something wrong. My high level perfectionism comes through. It's a hard one to shake. I hear that 100% in what you're saying of like, oh, I don't want to say anything because I'm terrified of getting it wrong. I've become really comfortable with this. Like, I'm going to say the wrong thing. And when I do, thank God, because I've identified another way, another thing that needs some inquiry. It's not an individual thing. I interviewed a woman called Leah Kim, who's got an amazing podcast called Voices on the Side, which I really recommend for everyone. It's a fantastic podcast which centers all different types of individuals from marginalized identities. And she said something to me on the episode, which is like, white privilege harms us all because it also takes away from us because we're creating divisive societies which actually harm other people. And because it harms other people, it also harms us, which was really powerful for me. Just to link that back to what I was saying, it's not an individualized problem. It's not like you're saying the wrong thing and you're a bad person because of it. This stuff is so systemic, intergenerational and collective that we're all in it and it's society-wide. It's like deprogramming ourselves from the collective narrative It's not your fault that you're saying or doing the stuff because it's a collective. Everyone's doing it, hence why it's systemic. So, you know, just in response to what you're saying there, it's like recognizing that it's okay to get it wrong. And to new coaches too, you know, you saying that like many people within your audience are new coaches, you know, how beautiful would it be if whilst you're developing the capacity to put yourself out there and say the thing and do the stuff, to also be thinking like, who is my audience within this? Like, how could I make this sound more inclusive? Who could I be excluding from this, or something like that? Just to have both things working in tandem at the same time, but not at the expense of putting yourself out there, because there's a lot of work that needs doing out there. So it's an all hands on deck situation. Certainly don't let the fear put you off in that respect.
I love what you said there, because I'm curious, like, what do you mean by collective? Like, what level is that? Is it a cultural, or is it just so interconnected? There's all these different collectives. That's just real curiosity.
Yeah, totally. I think that it depends on the circumstance, but like to what I was saying there, collective, I mean just kind of like societal wide. For example, looking at the way that trauma impacts us on a collective level. It's intergenerational, literally down from what happened to my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, the things that were actually passed down. But then also looking at collective trauma, systemic trauma, institutionalized trauma. Look at the police service, our healthcare systems, the prison service. There's integrated trauma, institutionalized racism always in the press. Our societal wide challenges, our authorities, our institutions, governmental level, it's insidious everywhere. It's not you doing something uniquely wrong. It's just, society wide.
It feels like it's so connected to this, just probably the biggest cosmic joke. The biggest paradox is just like, I don't matter, I'm so small. You look at the size of the universe, you're like, I'm so small, but then you actually truly understand the impact of one moment, walking down the street and smiling at someone, and they smile back, and then they go and smile to the next person who hugs that person. You realize the ripple effect is so great. I'm hearing and feeling in my body at this moment. Maybe a bit of a shake as well for me is like acknowledging my own privilege is probably such a good place to start. It's important and very challenging.
Totally. Absolutely. I mean, 100%. I get it. I just want to say one thing that came into my head just before I speak to what you've just said. Matthew McConaughey in Green Lights, which if you haven't read Green Lights, in fact, listen to it because he narrates it and it's so brilliant. He says this thing which really struck with me, which is exactly what you're saying. He recalls one day looking up at the stars and recognizing in that moment that he is so small. And as a result, he is at the same time limitless and tiny. So when you can kind of grapple with those things of like, you know, I'm so small, so it barely matters. So it doesn't matter if I mess it up. It's not going to destroy the planet. Maybe somebody's actions can mess up the planet. However, I'm so small, so it barely matters. But at the same time, because of that, I might as well just go for it. There's always a polarity with the universe. What you were saying reminded me of that. Speaking to what you said, I think the first step is acknowledging our privilege. That for me was a big step because it wasn't something I'd thought about, which is a privilege in itself. The fact that I have been on this planet, you know, for now a total of 35 years, when I haven't had to think about a load of stuff that other people do, I was like, wow, that is privilege. And like, I can't take it away. I can't change who I am. You know, I am in this body, I'm in this life for whatever reason. So I might as well make peace with it and use it in a positive, responsible way. And I think the first step is acknowledging that, dealing with all of the emotions that come up. There's an amazing person I follow on Instagram called Kerry Kelly, and she's contributed to a book called Collective Liberation, which I've just started. It's got all sorts of authors who've contributed. There's a great author called Dr. Sarah King, whose work I followed for a little while as well. she said something, I can't remember where it is, but basically like, you should always feel a bit uncomfortable when you're talking about privilege and when you're working through your privilege and decolonizing your work and decolonizing your mindset. If you don't feel uncomfortable, you're probably not doing it. So I also think that we just need to normalize that too, on the back of what you've just said.
Well, I think it's coming back to, if I link this to embodiment, right? Our body is our greatest tool, and actually having that awareness of when you feel uncomfortable and having the ability to center yourself, regulate, and using that as a sign of growth. There's something here for me. Like, I've hated confrontation for my whole life. This last year, I've lent into confrontation, and it's probably up there with the most growth I've ever had, because in that confrontation, it's like I start to free myself, but actually, as you say, free others on a collective level. I hadn't actually linked it on that level before. I'm really curious, because you use the word liberation. What does liberation mean to you?
It's almost hard to imagine, because I feel like we live in such an unliberated society at the moment. When I talk about collective liberation, it's a term that I've only recently, within the last year, come into contact with. The reason why I think that I came across it is my brand, my business is called Higher Love. It was always around us moving into this place of higher love for ourselves and on a vibrational level. And then when I started to come into this work, it was like, okay, I need to start standing for higher love for all. And what does that mean? Freedom has always been one of my biggest values. So I'm like, what does higher love for all mean? And I'm like, well, it means like freedom for all. It's like, what does that mean? And then, I came across this kind of collective liberation. And for me, we're seeing it a lot online at the moment. People talking about free Palestine, free Congo, free Sudan. It's like, we'll not be free until we are all free. What does that mean when we are all free? And, I guess that when we are beyond the systemic challenges, the oppression that is in place, when people are free to be themselves, to be seen, felt, valued, and treated as themselves without needing to siphon off parts of themselves, when people come into a place of wholeness with everything that they are, which is about radical compassion, radical acceptance. I think when we come into that place of radical wholeness within ourselves on a society-wide level, that is when I feel like we will achieve collective liberation. And I don't know what that looks like, Joel. But I really hope we get there.
It kind of brings to mind, I don't know if it was Michael Neal or Eckhart Tolle, who says, and I'm going to paraphrase roughly, but it's like, when you tend to your own garden, you're gardening for the world. Or, it's like when you look after yourself, when you heal yourself, you're actually healing others. It feels like it works the other way as well. People are in atrocities. That pain, that trauma is affecting everyone on a collective level. It's easy to take that on a kind of narcissistic way, in a way. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like, where it is that a shadow of this, where it's like becomes so self-absorbed? It's like, I'm healing, does that make sense at all?
Do you mean like when you go into that savior complex of just like, I'm here to do all of the healing for myself and the planet? Do you mean, is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's like that saying, I tend to my garden, I'm tending to the whole world. It's like, by healing myself, I'm healing the whole world. You can almost disconnect from what healing is, and perhaps it's a bit of a spiritual bypass, right? It's like, I'm doing the work on myself, but actually it's like coming from a very egotistical, narcissistic way. I have no idea if there's something in that, but it just...
Definitely. And I can't remember, is it the Gene Keys? I can't remember where I heard this, but how vanity is actually, once you go through the spiritual levels, vanity is almost the last thing to deal with, because we can't help it within our ego human reality when there is that pitfall, isn't it? I mean, God, I've done that of myself, of like, become so, in tune with my yoga practice. Look at me being a spiritually evolved being. We do. Anyone who's been in wellness for a long time who says that they haven't had those thoughts, I think is lying. The vanity piece is at the top tier of the individualized and collective shadow of the moral high ground. And they're like, I'm here to heal. I definitely see that a lot The savior complex is real. It's another invitation to see that and be like, okay, another pitfall, another thing for me to deal with.
I think for a lot of coaches, it's common, right? We get into coaching because we want to help people. I certainly know it was true for me, this idea of saving people. And what I noticed is by saving someone, I'm actually taking away their power. I'm doing this for my own ego to make myself feel good. It's a real shadow of coaching. Having compassion for that was how I got fulfillment when I was younger. It was a defense mechanism that I created.
I'd love to speak to that because within the last 6 months of my compassionate inquiry training during the mentorship program, the whole thing was really about what we were bringing as practitioners, as therapists, to our interactions with clients. So a lot about what they call sub-personalities. So your inner rescuer, your inner fixer, your inner helper, your inner pleaser, all of these things come out in your interactions with clients. I identified my inner fixer, and my supervisor was brilliant. We identified it together very early on. And it was a full-on existential crisis for me because I was like, am I only a coach because I like fixing people? If my inner fixer wasn't so in the driving seat, would I just be in a totally different career? Like that was a whole existential experience for me. The answer was no. I love my work and there are other parts of me and other reasons why I'm in this. And I also think that there's a beautiful side to wanting to help people too. I think we're connected beings. We enjoy being in community and connecting with one another. But what you're drawing attention to is these shadow parts of ourselves that do enter into the work we do. And again, it's nothing wrong. It's nothing bad, but it's just things to become aware of. Because as you just said, I noticed that my need to fix, like when my clients weren't getting results, then my inner fixer was like, I can't fix this person. I needed them to heal quicker, or I needed them to get results, or I needed them to get something, which is, as you just said, it's like disempowering somebody. And me returning to, I trust the innate capacity of this person to heal in a timeline meant for them. And I'm just here to guide that process and stand beside them during that process. And for me to notice when my inner fixer or rescuer or in a whatever stepped in. I think that that's a really beautiful aspect of the journey of coaching, that we get to see these parts of ourselves and be compassionate with ourselves. Because like you said, it was something that showed up for you in childhood. So why wouldn't it show up now? I mean, there are Gabor Mate talks about how most people that go into healing professions had challenges earlier on in life that they then stood into being the fixer, the helper, the rescuer, whatever it is that, that we're all actually just playing out these dynamics. And there's a beautiful side to that. And then there are also things that invite us to look at what we can heal for ourselves. So there is that beautiful polarity of the light side and the shadow side for us to look at.
I love that question of what am I bringing to the table? Because there's so much depth that never ends. And I think what I'm really getting from this conversation is having the courage to acknowledge and the openness and willingness to get it wrong, coupled with compassion and that beginner's mindset. That question is so beautiful because it can be as simple as I'm feeling a little agitated right now, or I'm quite full, or I'm quite tired. And it can be as deep as everything we've been talking about today. But really, I think something that's coming up for me is just having patience. If you're going to be a coach, you've got to be a coach for life, because this is life's work. We're never going to cover every aspect, because you say it's so deep, it's so interconnected. But be patient with this. This is life's work. The deeper we go with ourselves, the deeper we can take our clients. The more compassion, the more aware, the more inclusive, the more empathetic we can be in our coaching, the more powerful, the more impact, the more change we can have. Are there any final thoughts, things you'd like to share on this before we get into the quick fire questions?
Yeah, I would just love to say one more thing on that. The biggest thing that I have received through the last 18 months of the professional trauma training that I've done is recognizing that no parts of me are wrong. There is a book by Richard Swartz called No Bad Parts. He created the system IFS, Internal Family Systems. And it's about how every single part of you was created for a function, for a reason. Within the coaching industry, there is this narrative of getting rid of your limiting beliefs, getting over things. That was a massive shift for me, recognizing that even my limiting beliefs, even my fear, even my shame, even the ways that the things that I think are not good enough about myself, they were all created as a solution to a problem earlier on in my life. It's just that they continued on. And, just speaking to that piece about patience, it's like when we notice this stuff coming up about ourselves, it's not something that we have to make wrong, get over, make it go away. When we can meet it with compassion and be like, why did I start doing that? Like, what was happening for me earlier on in life that was a solution? Then we can step into a place, and the way that I speak to myself now is not like, oh, I can't believe I did that again. It's just like, wow, there's that little part of me, like inner Megan, inner child Megan, inner teenage Megan, showing up again, thinking that she needs to solve this problem in that kind of way. Wow, that was so painful for you back then. That's okay. We've got this. And it's really shifted the way that as a coach, I work on myself, but also with my clients, when we can bring that level of compassion to ourselves and the things we do wrong as coaches or not good enough as coaches. I feel like that is a real game changer. So I just wanted to share that.
Of that, if I just really quickly share my very high level journey with compassion, because I think compassion is actually something I've had a very challenging relationship with. I think for most of my life, I didn't even know what it meant. I was always like beat myself up to achieve a goal. And I had a vision recently of this graph where it's really erratic at the start. It's very extreme. It's going up and down, and there's a line in the center. It's going up and down, up and down. And then further along the line, it evens out and gets smoother. And then suddenly the vibrations are really smooth, and eventually it gets into the center. And what was really clear for me was that the difference between the center, or what brought you back to center, was compassion. So it's like compassion brings you back to wholeness. Compassion brings me back to presence. Compassion brings me back to now and wholeness. It was just such a profound moment. The other day I was doing hill sprints, and usually I beat myself up. That's how I would get to the top. And I was sprinting, and I was like, oh my word, this is way further than I thought. And I've gone out way too fast. And I said to myself, come on, you fat pig. Like unbelievable words. And I'll never say that words to my daughter, right?
Yeah.
But I was like, no, how about a bit of compassion now? And then I started going, come on, Joel, you can do this. You've got it. You're amazing. And I was just speaking to myself with so much more love and compassion. And then I had a little spring in my step, and I started smiling, and I got to the top way faster than had I just beat myself to there. And it was just another moment of like, compassion brings us back to wholeness. Compassion brings us back to completeness. It takes us out of competition. It takes us out of, I'm better than you. I got it wrong. It just brings us back to ease. And actually, what I'm learning is you achieve way more. I can't believe I admitted that out loud, but that was my
Thank you for sharing it.
That's how I've spoken to myself. It's so obvious when you speak it out loud. Like, how do you think a human would react if you called them a fat pig? But that's how I was speaking to myself.
Yeah.
No wonder I wanted to rebel. No wonder I binge ate and what have you, because that's just not a way to speak to yourself. It's so obvious when you speak it out loud. I think just having that awareness, and then awareness of the power of compassion. And for me, it's just a start as well. Beautiful work.
No. Yeah, definitely. I know we're going to move on to the quick fire. I can really resonate with what you're saying. Thank you for sharing it. It really reminded me of when I was 27, I was diagnosed with a untreatable hormone condition, and which I decided was not going to be untreatable, and decided to heal myself naturally and holistically, which I did. So it is treatable. One of the symptoms was that I'd gained a lot of weight because your hormones upset your metabolism, all sorts of things happening around the body. I'd gained a lot of weight, and I was looking at myself in the mirror saying, you look disgusting. I can't believe you look like this. You're so fat. Similar things that you were saying. I realized I needed to be my own best friend. If I was going to be on this healing journey, the only person that could be in charge of that was me. And I had to every minute, like when I caught myself in like a surface, a mirror, I had to actually step into that place of speaking lovingly to myself. In the beginning, it was hard because it felt like I was inserting multiple more thoughts. but it really shifted something in me. I can identify totally with what you're saying. And for new coaches listening, my biggest tip would be watch how you speak to yourself and do it lovingly. And then you can also support your clients to do the same. So I'll wrap it up there.
Amazing. I want to finish up with some quickfire questions.
Yes.
Firstly, what advice would you give to the version of you that just started coaching?
To the version of me that just started coaching. Okay, I know they're quickfire, so I'll be quick. I actually think that we've spoken about it in terms of be kinder, be more patient. It's a long-term, lifelong, career-long journey, so you don't have to get everything right. And yeah, just be kind to yourself, be compassionate with yourself. That's it.
Beautiful. And what advice would your future self give you now?
Really interestingly, what you said to me earlier of that conflict that you have in between really wanting to be seen and being terrified of being seen. I have a really similar thing, Joel. So my thing is one of my core woundings is I upset people by being myself, and it's not safe for me to shine. But then I continue to put myself into situations where I am out there, putting myself out there. And at the same time, it feels I'm healing the wounding around it, but also in the grittiest part of that, because there's that old part of me that's don't want to be in this right now. So I really experienced that conflict. And I guess what comes up for me there is the future version of me understands that it is always safe to shine, always safe to be, I won't say always safe to be seen because there's complexity around that, but an encouragement and an invitation to put myself, and for others listening, for them to put themselves out there and just be fully ourselves. Yeah. Just be the most authentic, vibrant, alive version of myself that I can be.
The third question is, what is your favorite coaching question?
What is my favorite coaching question? I would say that now, because of the work that I do, which is working in a trauma-informed way, it's become, what is the function of that? Or what is the purpose of that? What do you gain from that? In terms of when somebody is talking about a problem that they're experiencing, instead of me just stepping in and coaching them to get over the problem, it's understanding what function that behavior, that trait is serving in their life that is meeting a need that they have that needs to be met in a different way. It really flips the whole thing around, because then people can actually move on from the behavior, from the pattern, and find different ways to solve the problem that's underneath.
That. I'm curious, because I've asked a similar question in the past, but to someone who didn't have much depth. Their first response was nothing. I gained nothing. I'm no, let's stay with it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And there was nothing, just couldn't. I kind of let it go. I actually have avoided that question for quite some time, I think, from that experience, because I was met with that experience a few times. Well, I gained nothing. It's I don't want to do this. I don't want to drink anymore, or whatever. It's what do you respond in those moments?
Depends on the circumstance. For you to be working deeply with a client and to be going into those vulnerable spots, there has to be sufficient safety. There has to be sufficient attunement. If they don't feel safe with you, they're going to push back. I kind of gauge how deep I can continue to push without then stepping into the space of, I need this person to get there because of my inner advice giver or inner teacher has to come out, whatever it is. So understanding what I'm bringing in, but then really just trying to reveal to them that actually, if they weren't getting anything from it, they wouldn't be doing it. We just don't do things that don't give us anything, but it can be very subconscious. We often don't realize, and it can be really basic stuff. A lot of it is about connection. A lot of it about a feeling we're trying to elicit within ourselves. I would just keep asking it again. I might also say intuitively, maybe there is something coming up for me around, does it give you this? But I also wouldn't want to be leading too much. So I think it depends on the circumstance, but I would be inclined to dig a little bit beneath the hood on that one.
Yeah, beautiful. It's such a powerful coaching question. Last question, and I'm going to change it a little bit. So the question is, what message would you broadcast to the world on TV? But I'm actually going to change it to, what message would you broadcast to the whole coaching industry?
Oh, God. What message would I...
No pressure.
Yeah, I know. Bloody hell. What would I broadcast to the whole coaching industry? Something along the lines of pausing, really beginning a very deep inquiry as to the level of responsibility, inclusivity, diversity, and privilege we are speaking to within our spaces, and making sure that our work is in alignment with what I see as collective higher love, collective liberation, and just doing what we can contribute towards that. And I think that the tools for that is really, as we've discussed, compassion, humility, beginner's mindset, and a lot of self-compassion, recognizing that, like, of course we're wanting to do great stuff in the world, of course we're wanting to help, but also making sure that that is not at the expense of exclusivity. But hey, I'm on my soapbox about this at the moment. That's what I'd be saying currently.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Megan. Where can people find more about you? What should they do to follow you and to keep up with all the amazing work you're doing?
So my Instagram is higherlove_with_Megan, and my podcast is Higher Love with Megan. It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or major podcast platforms. Those are the best ways to stay connected.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's opened up a lot in me.
Thank you so much, Joel. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. It's great to have you with me on this journey towards higher love for all. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Please do take a moment to rate and review the show, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. All links, references, and contact information is detailed too within the show notes. And I always love to hear your feedback, so feel free to hit me up on my Instagram at higherlove_with_Megan, or via my website, higher-love.com. Send your takeaways, and if you enjoyed this episode, please share or send on to someone else who would benefit. Until next time, big love.